Hello everybody. So today I want to talk about a motor vehicle accident that just happened on Mavis and Eglinton. That's a very busy intersection, and that's also where one of the mosques is located. So a lot of people usually go back and forth in that area. In the past, I've had a client actually who had a very serious car accident there. He was charged with racing, and a number of individuals were thrown out of his vehicle. But today, what I want to talk about is the accident that took place with a motor vehicle causing a death of a pedestrian. Now, this can happen to any of us. We all drive a car, and the problem is you never know when a pedestrian is or is not going to be crossing the road, so you have to be extremely cautious. And if you happen to be in a car accident where a pedestrian gets struck, that can be life-altering and catastrophic consequences for yourself. So let's watch the news with respect to what just recently happened, and I'll make some comments and in respect to what you should and shouldn't be doing while you're driving your vehicle, and what you should be expecting once the police get involved in such an investigation.
We'll begin with this. A pedestrian has died in hospital after being hit by a vehicle late last night in Mississauga. Steve Ryan is standing by. He is at the scene already.
Okay, so this is a motor vehicle accident in which a pedestrian, after being struck, actually ended up dying. So this can happen to anybody. So the consequences that flow from this can be extremely serious. They can range all the way from criminal prosecution to obviously insurance issues, which are the least problematic issues of all.
Ready this morning at Mavis and Eglinton. Steve, good morning. Was it right at that intersection, Steve? That's a major one.
You're right, it is a major intersection, and yes, Gurdeep, it was right in the intersection. Mavis and Eglinton here in Mississauga. Eglinton east and west, Mavis north and south. The pedestrian was crossing on the south side of Eglinton from the east side to the west side with the traffic signal. This is controlled by a traffic light.
Okay, so here you know that car accident having taken place in Mavis and Eglinton, and you can see the motor vehicle there, and underneath you'll see the parts and compartments of the vehicle that have fallen apart. We don't know whether the pedestrian was on any form of vehicle, whether he had a bicycle, whether he had a motorcycle, whether he was picking or moving some items along in a trolley or a cart. So those items underneath the wheel there may be those items. And in the car accident, you can see the windshield having been smashed. So these are the things that the police are going to be investigating, but let's see what else they have to say.
As you can see, the driver was traveling east.
Here, so you have a close-up of the vehicle now, and you can see the amount of damage that was done. And this is a vehicle striking an individual. Well, we don't know, as I said earlier, whether the individual had in his hands, or was he carrying a bicycle, or was he on a motorcycle, just walking across the road. That is information that will come out later, obviously. But the impact is a pretty serious impact on that vehicle.
Bound along Eglinton to make a right turn to go south on Mavis. That's when the driver struck the pedestrian. So the question for the investigators now becomes, what's a traffic light?
Here again, now you can see the impact on the vehicle, and you can see where the pointer is pointing at the front end. There's a dent in the windshield, there's a dent in the hood, there's a dent in the top of the car. And you can see in the corner here the shoe of the individual who was struck. So it is a pretty serious collision, causing a motor vehicle to be impacted in that manner. So no wonder one can imagine that the individual who was struck ultimately passed away as a result of this impact.
Light working, number one, and why did the driver not see the pedestrian? As we all know, as a driver, when you're approaching a red light to make a right turn, you have to stop. Otherwise, it is a fail to stop at red light, just like you blew a red light going straight.
Okay. So here, the newscaster is telling you about the fact that most of us should be stopping, but quite a few individuals don't in fact stop when you get to a red light and you're making that turn. You're supposed to, and by law, come to a complete stop at a red light before you make that right turn. And if you don't, and there happens to be somebody walking, or even if not, you can get a ticket for that. And the problem is, especially if you're driving at night, it's very dangerous and you have to be very careful.
Straight. Did the driver stop? Was the pedestrian doing anything inappropriate? And why did the driver not see the pedestrian? They're going to be the...
Right. So one of the questions he poses is about why the driver didn't see the pedestrian. Well, we don't know whether he saw him or he saw him late. I always advise people that when you're out late at night, don't wear dark clothing. That's going to be part of the investigation. The individual who got struck, was he wearing black shirts, black pants, black shoes? And if all your attire when you're out there in the middle of the night is black, it becomes that much more difficult for somebody in a motor vehicle to see you. So it's a good idea whenever you're out late at night, whether you're on a bicycle or not, that you should wear clothing that's reflective. So that light shines off your clothes, and at least a driver has that fraction of a second more to be able to decipher that there's some object in the middle of the road. And talking about objects, I had a case in a client of mine at one occasion was in fact charged when a child, the age of about 4 years old, was walking in the street, and he was unable to see that child, and he in fact ran over that child. So this happens quite common. It's very common. It's just you have to be very, very diligent when you're driving a motor vehicle.
Questions that need to be answered by the investigators, and at that point they'll determine whether or not charges will be laid. So the key...
So now you hear the newscaster talking about charges being laid or not. There's not been a determination obviously made at this time. The police are cordoning off. You can see the tape going up, and once they've put that tape up, obviously nobody can go in that area. They're going to investigate the scene, and they're going to determine why this accident happened. They'll call specialists out there, and they're going to be looking at the tire tracks and whether or not there are any skid marks on the road, whether or not the brake was applied appropriately, and when and how the brake was applied. Those are things that they're going to investigate. Not only that, depending upon the vehicle, most vehicles nowadays have computers in them. So those computers are constantly monitoring the speed at which a vehicle is traveling, and they're also monitoring when you place the brake and when you didn't place the brake. So they're going to be trying to get eventually access to that data inside the vehicle, and that will give them further information about whether or not the vehicle was traveling at an excessive speed or rate or not. Not only that, not only can the police get data and information about the vehicle's movement from the vehicle computer itself, if the individual driving their motor vehicle had a cell phone, they can obviously track that too to determine where this individual is coming from, where they're going, and those are added clues that the police can then use to determine whether or not a criminal act has been committed.
Important point will be the intersection itself, and of course they are looking for witnesses, and the vehicle that was involved will be examined by a mechanic, a professional mechanic run by the police. They'll determine whether or not that vehicle was in proper working order with regards to its brakes, its headlights, and anything else that may have made that vehicle not come to a complete stop. These are all questions that will be answered. And then...
Okay, so that's a very important point. Like, when you are driving a motor vehicle, that's 2,000 or 3,000 pounds of vehicle that most of us are driving. You have a duty to ensure that vehicle is in proper working order. When this vehicle now gets tested, they're going to check for tire treads, whether or not the tire treads were appropriate, whether the brake pads were appropriate level, whether or not the brakes had been maintained, whether or not the lights were working, front lights, the back lights. All of these things are going to then be factors the police are going to use to determine whether or not the individual driving this motor vehicle should be charged. You can be charged for reckless endangerment of life as well. Because if you know that your brakes aren't working, if you know the brakes need to be changed, or if you know the lights need to be changed and you haven't bothered to get that work done, you are then endangering everybody on the road. So it's very important that if you ever see signs of wear and tear on your vehicle, that you take it to a mechanic and you get those checked properly. You don't want to be driving around a car that's experiencing problems or the brake pads are wearing down. I'm sure people have seen many occasions individuals driving around in the car, brakes are squeaking. That is not appropriate, and if that turns out to be the case, the police are not going to be looking at you favorably. Okay,
after all of that's determined, charges will or will not be laid based on all that information I just provided to you. And the pedestrian passed in the hospital a couple hours after being struck by the car. Peel Regional Police are looking for witnesses. So if you were in this intersection at around 11 o'clock last night,
as the reporter indicates, the individual who was struck by the motor vehicle did pass away a few hours later. obviously succumbing to the injuries. We saw the impact on the motor vehicle. One can only imagine the impact that resulted on the individual himself. They're also looking for individuals or witnesses who may be around, and again, those witnesses will provide information to the police with respect to the movement of the vehicle, how fast it was going, whether the driver stopped, whether he was signaling. The key here is even at nighttime, if you're making a turn at a stop sign, you need to stop and you still need to signal. Even though there's nobody on the road, you have to signal, especially because it's nighttime. You may not see the other individual who's crossing the street, but at least that pedestrian can then see your vehicle's signal flashing. And so you have to observe those rules of the road, and those are things that they're going to look at, and hopefully if they find a witness who says yes, the car was signaling, yes, he stopped, these will all be things in favor of the individual who's driving that vehicle.
And you saw something, or you think you may have seen something, the police are asking that you give them a call. Any information you have could be very important to this investigation. I'll send it back to you.
Hey, Steve, appreciate that. We'll talk to you again at 5:30.
All right, so I'm going to stop that video. I've said a lot about what potentially happened during the course of this incident, but what's more important is what can result as a consequence of a motor vehicle accident where you end up striking a pedestrian. In this particular incident, the person died as a result of the accident. The best case scenario for the individual who is driving the motor vehicle is the police investigate and decide not to lay any criminal charges because he was not at fault, and they determined that the pedestrian was either running, or he was potentially drunk, or he was on drugs. It could be a slew of reasons why somebody is in the middle of the road and got struck. So those would be factors that would assist the individual who's driving the vehicle. However, if it is determined that the motor vehicle was not maintained properly, or the stops weren't done, or the signals weren't given, or the individual driving that vehicle was in any shape, form negligent or reckless with respect to ensuring that his vehicle was appropriately maintained, and that he had whether he had a valid driving license, whether he had insurance, all of these are factors the police are going to look into, and that individual could face criminal charges. These charges could range from vehicular manslaughter, and you could look at a number of years in jail, depending upon what the consequences are as a result of the investigation. So driving a motor vehicle is not your right, it is an obligation. It is followed with a number of responsibilities that once you take on those responsibilities, you have to make sure that you follow them. So having these accidents happen, and they happen quite often, one of the things I would say is, if you're going to be out late at night as a pedestrian, or you're biking, or anything that's going to be on the road, please make sure that you wear clothing that is reflective. Do not go out there in dark clothing, and it's happened so many occasions with myself as well, I'm sure with a lot of people, that you're backing out of your driveway, or you're about to make a turn, and you think the whole road is clear, everything is okay, and at the very last second, the fraction of a second, you see somebody just jump right behind, or somebody's out late for a jog at night, or they're out early jogging in the morning, and you don't see them, and it's just your fortune that at that moment, at the last second, you're able to spot them. So in these instances, you have to ensure that your motor vehicle is properly maintained, and that you are vigilant and you're observing all the rules and the laws, because if you're not, you could end up facing criminal charges and be looking at jail time, as much as 3 to 4 years in jail on a day that you were simply out driving your vehicle like any other day, and unexpectedly your life changes. So be careful when you go out there, and look after for pedestrians, because at the end of the day, when you are in a motor vehicle, you are responsible, not the pedestrian. The responsibility shifts to you, given the fact that you are driving a motor vehicle.